Today we are going to read Chapter 4 from Flat Stanley, His Original Adventure. Chapter 4 is titled The Museum Thieves. Before we begin reading Chapter 4, I want to recap Chapters 1 through 3 that we already read this week. In Chapter 1, Stanley woke up flat because an enormous bulletin board had fallen on him. So his mom took him to the doctor, but the doctor said he would be okay. So Stanley remained flat. In Chapter 2, Stanley got to go see his friend Thomas in California, and he got there through the mail because his parents thought it was too expensive to fly or take a train, so they folded him up into an envelope and sent him along his way. And he got returned the same way from California. In Chapter 3, Stanley's brother Arthur was getting a bit jealous because Stanley got to do a lot of fun things, being flat. So one day when Stanley and Arthur went to the park, Arthur was upset because all these kids were flying kites, so Stanley let him make him into a kite and fly him around. Stanley did get a little upset with Arthur, though, because he left him wedged in between a tree, and Stanley got stuck in the tree. So let's read Chapter 4, The Museum Thieves, and find out what's going on. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the lamb chops. Mr. Dart was an important man, the director of the famous Museum of Art downtown in the city. Stanley Lambchop had noticed in the elevator that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a cheerful man, had become quite gloomy, but he had no idea what the reason was. Let's look at the word gloomy. Okay, gloomy means sad, depressed. Okay, you're not a happy person. Okay, you don't want to be gloomy because you're not happy. And then at breakfast one morning, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop talking about Mr. Dart. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, reading the paper over his coffee cup, "that still another painting has been stolen from the Farmhouse Museum. It says here that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wit's end." Okay, when you're at your wit's end, it means you've had enough. You can't take any more. "Oh dear, are the police no help?" Mrs. Lambchop asked. "It seems not," said Mr. Lambchop. "Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We suspect a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman's ball and not park their cars where signs say don't." The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves work at night," Mr. Dart said. "It is very hard for our guards to stay awake when they have been on duty all day. And the famous museum is so big, we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless." Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had lit up in the air above his head, giving out little shooting lines of excitement, Stanley Lambchop had an idea. He told it to Mr. Dart. "Stanley," Mr. Dart said, "if your mother will give her permission, I will put you and your plan to work this very night." Mrs. Lambchop gave her permission, "But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I won't have you up till all hours unless you do." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall where the biggest and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a huge painting that showed a bearded man wearing a floppy velvet hat, playing a violin for a lady who lay on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them, and 3 fat children with wings were flying around above. That, Mr. Dart explained, was the most expensive painting in the world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It is time for you to put on a disguise." "I already thought of that," Stanley Lambchop said, "and I brought one. My cowboy suit. It has a red bandana that I can tie over my face. Nobody will recognize me in a million years." "No," Mr. Dart said, "you will have to wear the disguise I have chosen." From a closet, he took a white dress with a blue sash. And I want to look at the word sash really quickly. Okay, a sash is a long strip of cloth worn over the shoulder and tied by the waist. So it kind of goes around you and ties around your waist. So from a closet he took a white dress with a blue sash, a pair of shiny little pointed shoes, a wide straw hat with a blue band that matched the sash, and a wig and a stick. The wig was made of blonde hair, long and done in ringlets. The stick was curved at the top, and it too had a blue ribbon on it. In this shepherdess disguise, Mr. Dart said, you will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have cowboy pictures in the main hall. Stanley was so disguised, he could hardly speak. Stanley was so disgusted, he could hardly speak. I will look like a girl. That's what I will look like, he said. I wish I had never had my idea. But he was a good sport, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb up into the empty picture frame. Stanley was able to stay in place because Mr. Dart had cleverly put 4 small spikes in the wall, one for each hand and foot. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like a picture. Except for one thing, Mr. Dart said. Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and at the sky. You look fierce, not happy, Stanley. Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes and even to smile a bit. Mr. Dart stood back a few feet and stared at him for a moment. Well, he said, it may not be art, but I know what I like. He went off to make sure that certain parts of Stanley's plan were taken care of, and Stanley was left alone. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could just make out the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the bearded man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting, as he was, for something to happen. Time passed, and he got tireder and tireder. Anyone would be tired this late at night, especially if he had to stand in a picture frame balancing on little spikes. Maybe they won't come, Stanley thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and then the main hall was pitch dark. It seemed to get quieter, too, with the darkness. There was absolutely no sound at all. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle beneath the golden curls of the wig. Creak! The creaking sound came from right out in the middle of the main hall, and even as he heard it, Stanley saw in the same place a tiny yellow glow of light. The creaking came again, and the glow got bigger. A trap door had opened in the floor, and 2 men came up through it into the hall. Stanley understood everything all at once. These must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trapdoor entrance into the museum from outside. That was why they had never been caught. And now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. He held very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. This is it, Max, said the first one. This is where we art robbers pull a sensational job whilst the civilized community sleeps. Right, Luther, said the man. In all this great city there is no one to suspect us. Ha ha, thought Stanley Lambchop, that's what you think. The sneak thieves put down their lantern and took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. Let's look at the word lantern. A lantern is similar to a flashlight, and it's a handheld lamp with a see-through cover. You use them a lot for camping. People use them for. Some people have them in their house in case the power ever goes out, but it is similar to a flashlight. What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max, the first man asked. We would kill him. What else, his friend replied. That was enough to frighten Stanley, and he was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. This sheep girl, Luther said. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared. Just in time, Stanley managed to get a faraway look in his eyes again and to smile, sort of. You're crazy, Luther, Max said. She's smiling, and what a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley furious. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned back to the world's most expensive painting, and he shouted in his loudest, most terrifying voice, Please, please, Mr. Dart, the sneak thieves are here. The sneak thieves looked at each other. Max, said the first one very quietly, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. I think I did too, said Max in a quivery voice. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest. You'll get a rest all right, shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guards and policemen behind him. You'll get arrested, that's what. Ha, ha. Ha. The sneak thieves were too mixed up by Mr. Dart's joke and too frightened by the policemen to put up a fight. Before they knew it, they had been handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Lambchop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was all in the newspapers. Stanley was a hero. So we'll have to read the next chapter to see how people feel about this, especially his brother Arthur, who tends to get a little jealous. Right now you're going to work on your form that has some questions about our 3 vocabulary words, gloomy, lantern, and sash, and then some comprehension questions on this chapter.